I live relatively close to Yosemite National Park, YNP, and see it as an incredible and enchanting place. I feel extremely fortunate to be within driving distance of a location that people from around the globe come to see. Every time I've taken the opportunity to visit the park, it's been an unforgettable experience. My only regret is not visiting more frequently. I've stayed overnight in the Yosemite Valley area twice. The first time was at housekeeping camp. I knew the accommodations were close to others, and I figured that other visitors enjoying themselves, clearly with a lot of alcohol, would be okay. I don't drink and can't understand why anyone would come to such an awe-inspiring place just to get wasted. But everyone has their reasons. I was there for mine, and others came for theirs. I accepted that, except for the people right next to me who decided to drink all night. As often happens with alcohol, they got louder and louder until 4 a.m. They weren't obnoxious, but they were very loud and I didn't get any quality sleep. My plans for the next day were ruined as I was exhausted and frustrated. This past weekend, I stayed in the valley again. I knew the campsites were practically on top of each other, but was still hoping for the best. The group of 3 set up about 10 feet from our tent seemed pretty low-key. They were playing music at a low volume and just chatting. I was worn out from a long day of hiking, so I crawled into the tent around 8:30 and quickly fell asleep. About an hour and a half later, I woke up to hear one of the people in the trio right next to me crying hysterically, clearly drunk. Loud, sobbing, and inconsolable, they sounded like they had just lost a loved one or a pet. This went on for over an hour before they finally calmed down. I fell back asleep around 1 a.m., only to wake again to the same person vomiting and retching loudly just outside their tent. They kept vomiting all night long into the next morning. It sounded like they had alcohol poisoning and probably should have packed up and gone home, or to urgent care. It was that bad. I could hear their campmates trying to get them to drink water or eat something, but they refused and just sat outside the tent, puking and dry heaving. It was awful. I didn't get any decent rest, my plans for a full day of hiking were ruined, and I was angry. I was tired and feeling this unpleasant frustration bubbling up inside me. It was the opposite of how I wanted to feel when visiting this beautiful, magical place that usually brings me peace. The next morning, I saw that this person had vomited all over the campsite. I put off eating anything, not surprisingly, and packed up everything to leave as early as possible. As we were leaving, this person was still making awful noises and hanging their head out of the tent. Nearby campers offered them antacids, coffee, and food, none of which they accepted. Is the valley always full of drunk idiots? Or do I just have the worst luck? I won't stay in the valley again. I drove over to Tioga Pass and checked out Tamarack Campground. It looks amazing, huge spots, and secluded. Maybe the silver lining in all this is that I found a much better place that I wouldn't have considered before. I thought going camping with my ex-husband might help us clear the air, maybe even bring some peace between us. We didn't split up in a huge fight, but there was always this tension that never really went away. Spending a few days in the woods together seemed like a good way to end things on a better note. The plan was simple: a quiet spot by the lake, a small campfire, and nothing but nature around us. The first day was calm. We set up the tent, gathered some firewood, and sat by the water, watching the sun slowly sink below the trees. It was quiet, almost too quiet. We both acted like everything was fine, but the silence between us was heavy. As night came, the air grew colder, and I felt a chill that wasn't just from the temperature. It was like a tight feeling in my stomach, like something was wrong, but I couldn't figure out what. That night, I couldn't sleep well. Every small noise seemed louder, sharper, the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs. It all kept me on edge. I kept telling myself it was just the forest, that there was nothing out there. But no matter how many times I tried to reassure myself, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I turned over and over in my sleeping bag, trying to get comfortable, but no matter what I did, I couldn't get warm. The next morning felt different. There was this weird tension in the air, even thicker than before. We didn't talk much, just went about our business, pretending like everything was okay. But the longer we stayed out there, the more I noticed little things. The way he kept glancing at me when he thought I wasn't looking. The way he was quieter than usual, almost too quiet. It was like he was waiting for something, and I had no idea what. By the second night, that uneasy feeling grew stronger, to the point where I couldn't ignore it anymore. The forest seemed darker, the sounds more threatening. The wind picked up, howling through the trees, and I felt like the darkness was closing in around us. I tried to focus on the campfire, its warmth and light, but it wasn't enough to push away the growing fear. Then I started noticing things that made me really uncomfortable. His movements were strange, deliberate. He was poking at the fire, but his eyes kept darting toward the tent, then back to me. I couldn't figure out what he was thinking, but the look in his eyes wasn't one I recognized. There was something there, something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't exactly fear, but it was close. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I lay there, listening to the sounds outside and to his breathing next to me. I felt trapped, surrounded by darkness with no escape. The hours dragged on, and all I could think about was getting out of there. Away from him. Away from whatever this was turning into. When the morning finally came, I was exhausted, but I knew I had to leave. I told him I wasn't feeling well and needed to head back early. He didn't argue, just nodded, but the way he looked at me when I said it made my heart race. There was something in his eyes, something dark, something I didn't want to face. We packed up in silence, and I kept my distance, making sure to stay close to the car. As we drove back to town, the tension didn't ease up, not even a little. If anything, it got worse. The road felt longer, the air inside the car heavier. I could feel his eyes on me, even when I wasn't looking. When we finally got back, I grabbed my things and left without saying much. As soon as I was out of his sight, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders, but the unease stayed with me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been wrong during that trip. Something that wasn't just about us. A few days later, I found something that made my stomach drop. There was a small tear in my sleeping bag, right where my back would have been. It wasn't big, but it looked like it had been made with something sharp. I hadn't noticed it before, but now it stood out, clear as day. I tried to think back, tried to remember when it could have happened, but I couldn't. The more I thought about it, the more everything started to make sense. The way he had been acting, the looks he gave me, the silence. It wasn't just the woods that had me on edge. It was him. I had gone out there thinking it was just a simple camping trip, but now I wasn't so sure. I couldn't prove anything, couldn't say for certain what had been on his mind. But I knew one thing for sure, I wasn't safe with him anymore. I couldn't shake the thought of how easily things could have gone wrong out there. We were alone, far from anyone who could help. And I kept wondering, what if? What if that small tear in my sleeping bag had been meant for more than just a scare? What if it had been a warning, a reminder that no matter how things had ended between us, there was still a dark side to him that I hadn't fully seen before? That thought still keeps me up at night, because now I know there's a part of him I don't recognize, a part that I don't think I ever will, and I can't help but wonder if that part of him is waiting for the right moment to come back, to finish what he might have started out there in the woods. That's a fear I can't shake, no matter how much I try to convince myself that it's over. Because deep down, I know it's not. I drove up to the old cabin, a place full of memories from my childhood. My grandmother had always loved it here, hidden away in the woods, far from the city noise. After she passed away, the cabin was left to me, and I decided to spend a weekend there alone to clear my head and remember her. The cabin looked just as I remembered, with its old wooden walls and the small porch that overlooked a quiet, dark pond. The trees around it seemed to lean in, making long shadows that played tricks on my eyes. I settled in, unpacked, and decided to take a walk around the property to enjoy the fresh air and solitude. As evening came, I headed back to the cabin. That's when I noticed something strange. The back door, which I was sure I had locked, was slightly open. I was certain I had locked it, but I brushed off the thought, figuring I must have missed it. I closed it firmly and went inside, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. That night, as I tried to sleep, I kept hearing noises outside, rustling leaves, soft thuds, and what sounded like footsteps. I tried to tell myself it was just animals, but the noises were too clear. I turned on all the lights, checked the locks on the doors and windows, and even moved a heavy chair in front of the back door for extra security. The noises grew louder as the night went on, almost like someone was deliberately trying to scare me. Around midnight, I heard a loud bang coming from the storage shed at the edge of the property. My heart raced as I grabbed a flashlight and a heavy wrench I kept for emergencies. I knew I had to check it out, even though every part of me wanted to stay inside. I approached the shed carefully. The door was slightly open, swinging in the light breeze. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a messy pile of old tools and rusty equipment. I shone the light around, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to head back, I noticed something unsettling. A set of fresh, muddy footprints leading from the shed to the back of the cabin. They were large and recent. My heart sank as I followed them back to the cabin. The prints stopped right at the edge of the porch. I ran inside and locked the door, my mind racing. Whoever had been outside was clearly trying to get in. I moved the chair away from the back door and decided to stay up, keeping the lights on and listening for any sounds. The night dragged on, but the noises eventually stopped. As dawn broke, I felt a mix of relief and exhaustion. I decided to pack up and leave early. When I was finally ready to drive away, I noticed that the muddy footprints had been washed away by the rain that had started in the early morning. It seemed like whoever had been there had left just before the storm began. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The sense of unease lingered long after I left the cabin. That night, I found a small note hidden under the seat of my car. It was handwritten and simply said, "You were not alone. Watch your back." I never found out who left it or what they wanted, but the realization that someone had been so close and left a message gave me chills. It was a stark reminder that even in the places where you feel safest, danger can be closer than you think. I had rented a remote cabin for a week, hoping to get away from city life. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any neighbors. The only sounds were the rustling leaves and the occasional bird call. The cabin was old but had a cozy feel, with its stone fireplace and wooden floors that creaked under my feet. The first few days were just as I had hoped, peaceful and relaxing. But on the fourth night, things changed. I was sitting by the fire, reading a book, when I heard a noise outside. It was a soft scratching sound, like someone dragging something across the ground. I thought it was probably a small animal or a branch hitting the side of the cabin. The scratching went on and off all night, getting louder and more persistent. By morning, I was uneasy, but tried to convince myself it was just the wind or animals. I decided to go for a hike to clear my head. As I walked through the woods, I noticed something odd. Big, deep scratches on the trees, all pointing toward the cabin. The scratches were fresh, with dark stains on the bark that looked like dried blood. When I got back to the cabin, I saw that the door was slightly open, even though I was sure I had closed it tightly. My heart pounded as I pushed the door open, checking the room for any signs of someone breaking in. Everything seemed in place, but the uneasy feeling stayed with me. That night, the scratching started again, but this time it was more intense. I decided to check it out. Grabbing a flashlight and a heavy wrench I found in the cabin's storage closet, I went outside, shining the flashlight around the cabin. The light revealed something disturbing. Footprints leading away from the back of the cabin, where the ground was freshly disturbed. The footprints were large and human-like, but they just stopped as if the person had disappeared suddenly. I spent the rest of the night wide awake, every creak and groan of the cabin making me jump. The next morning, I decided to leave early. I packed my things quickly, always looking over my shoulder. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin. The scratching had stopped, but the unsettling feeling remained. A few weeks later, I found out from a local that there had been reports of someone in the area who stalked cabins, sometimes vandalizing them, or worse. It hit me hard. I'd been alone in a place where someone with bad intentions could have easily been hiding. The realization was chilling. It was a stark reminder of how isolated and vulnerable one can be, and how quickly a peaceful getaway can become a terrifying ordeal. As I think back, I wonder if that scratching noise was a warning that someone was out there, watching and waiting. The thought that someone might have been hiding in the woods, just beyond my sight, still sends shivers down my spine. We were sent to a remote area deep in the woods, far away from any town. The old cabin we were assigned to looked like it hadn't been used in a long time. The roof was a little crooked, and the wood had turned gray from age. There was something creepy about the place, but it was where we had to stay for the next few weeks. At first, everything was normal. The nights were quiet, filled with the usual sounds of the forest, crickets chirping, leaves rustling in the breeze, and an occasional owl hooting. But then things started to feel different. It began with small noises. I thought it was just the old cabin settling at first, but soon I noticed the sounds were too regular for that. It was like someone was moving around outside, walking in circles around the cabin. I would sit up in bed, listening hard to catch every little sound. The whole time, I felt like someone, or something, was watching us from the darkness just beyond the trees. One night, I heard footsteps on the porch. They were slow, almost like whoever it was knew we were inside. I held my breath, hoping they'd go away, but they didn't. Instead, the door creaked like someone was trying to open it. The latch held, but the door kept shaking. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might explode. I grabbed my rifle, my hands trembling as I pointed it at the door. But just as suddenly as it had started, the noise stopped. I was left alone in the silence, with nothing but the sound of my own breathing. The next day, I found footprints in the dirt around the cabin. They weren't animal prints. They were from a person, barefoot. Deep prints, like someone had been walking around all night. The others shrugged it off, saying it was probably one of us fooling around, but I knew better. There was something wrong out here, something that didn't want us here. The last night I couldn't sleep. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling, listening, and then I heard it again. Those footsteps. But this time they were inside. They were slow, careful, moving from one end of the cabin to the other. I stayed still, trying to tell myself it was all in my head. But then I heard breathing, low and rough, coming from the corner of the room. I was frozen with fear. I wanted to jump up, to grab my rifle, but I couldn't move. The breathing got louder, closer, until it felt like it was right next to me. I could feel its heat on my face, smell the nasty odor that came with it. And then, just like that, it stopped. The next morning, I packed my stuff and left the cabin. I didn't care about orders. I couldn't stay there another minute. As I walked away, I could feel eyes on me, watching me leave. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew whatever had been there with us was still there, and it wasn't going anywhere. It was just waiting for the next group to come along. I never told anyone what happened. Who would believe me? But I'll never forget that cabin. The way it felt like it was alive, like it was aware of us the whole time. And I'll never go back. Some places are better left alone no matter what anyone says. The worst part? Every now and then late at night, I can still hear that breathing. It's like a faint echo, just out of reach, as if the cabin found a way to follow me. Maybe it's all in my head, or maybe once you've been there, a part of you never really leaves. And that thought, more than anything, keeps me up at night. I'm a summer camp counselor, and I work every summer at a camp for 5 weeks. One time, we were backpacking to the tallest peak in my state. At night, a coworker friend and I decided to go on a night hike to get away from the kids. We laid down on a grassy slope to stargaze about a quarter mile from everyone else. As we were lying there, I heard the most beautiful sound of water behind me. And I mean, beautiful. I had never heard water running like that before, and I thought to myself, wow, this sounds amazing. All I could imagine was crisp, clear water gracefully trickling by. This image was stuck in my head, and I felt a sudden urge to find it. It wasn't just an urge, it felt like a need. Behind us was a dense forest, and the brush would have made it difficult to navigate at night, but the water sounded close. My friend and I looked at each other without saying a word, and I knew he was having the exact same thought. I said to myself, let's wait 5 minutes, then decide if we should check it out. It felt like a playful presence was trying to persuade us to go over there. Eventually, I decided we should check it out. Without saying anything to each other, we stood up. It just sort of happened. As we approached the sound, it became quieter and quieter. We stopped, unsure if we wanted to continue. Suddenly, the sound of trickling water grew louder again until it sounded like we were standing next to a river. That's when I said, let's come back tomorrow and find it. My friend agreed. The moment we made that decision, the sound of the creek vanished along with the urge to find it. There was only silence. The playful presence from earlier suddenly felt sinister. It was a dark, oppressive feeling, similar to the sensation of knowing someone is watching you. Fear began creeping up from my belly, and we quickly walked back to camp without speaking. Once we got back, we started talking about what had happened. My friend admitted he had the exact same urge to find the creek and the same internal struggle to resist it. When we returned to camp, it felt like a trance had been lifted. Only then did we realize how abnormal the whole experience had been. The urge I felt didn't seem like my own. It's hard to explain, but it felt like it had been placed in my mind. Once the sound of water stopped, so did the urge. The next morning, we went back to the spot and searched for the creek. We looked and looked, but couldn't find any water. Later, we checked maps of the area and confirmed there weren't any creeks nearby. To this day, I'm scared to imagine what would have happened if we had followed that sound. The ominous presence we felt was unsettling. If I'd been alone, I might have thought I imagined the whole thing, but my friend experienced everything exactly as I did. I don't know what it was, but it was eerie, to say the least. What's even stranger is that neither of us spoke a word to each other after hearing the sound of water, yet we both decided to investigate. We both felt that sinister presence trying to lure us in, and I'm thankful we decided to return the next day instead of giving in to the urge in that moment. It was supposed to be a simple weekend away. My ex-wife and I thought that spending a few days in a cabin far away from everything might help ease some of the tension after the divorce. We didn't have kids, so there was no reason to stay in touch, but there was still a lot that hadn't been talked about. We figured that a quiet weekend in the woods might help us leave things on better terms. The cabin was deep in the woods, far from any town, and there was no cell service. It was a small, old wooden place with one bedroom, a fireplace, and a tiny kitchen. It felt like the kind of place that had been there forever, like it had seen a lot of people come and go. The first night was quiet. We made a simple dinner, talked a little, and went to bed early. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that feels more like an agreement to avoid certain topics than a natural part of being alone in the woods. We both pretended to sleep, but it was clear that neither of us was comfortable. The unease was too strong to ignore. The next day, we decided to go for a walk. The paths around the cabin were narrow and overgrown, but we figured it would be a good way to pass the time. We walked for hours, barely speaking, just listening to the sound of our footsteps and the wind in the trees. It felt like the forest was watching us, the way the trees seemed to close in as the path narrowed. By the time we got back to the cabin, it was almost dark. That night, something felt wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. It was like the cabin itself was alive, watching us, listening to us. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks, that being so far away from everything was making me paranoid, but the feeling wouldn't go away. In the middle of the night, I got up to use the bathroom. The cabin was pitch black, the only light coming from the last bits of wood burning in the fireplace. As I walked down the hallway, I heard a noise behind me. A soft creak, like someone stepping on an old floorboard. I stopped and listened, but the sound didn't come again. I slowly turned around, expecting to see something or someone, but there was nothing, just the empty hallway leading back to the bedroom. I stood there for a long time, trying to convince myself it was just the house settling. But then I heard it again, closer this time, like someone was right behind me. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the hallway was still empty. My pulse raced, but I forced myself to keep moving. When I got back to bed, I couldn't sleep. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to every little sound the cabin made. It felt like the place was shifting, groaning under some invisible weight. My ex-wife was sleeping soundly beside me, unaware of the tension growing inside me. I tried to tell myself I was just tired, but the feeling of being watched only grew stronger. The next morning, I woke up to find her gone. Her side of the bed was cold, the blankets pulled back neatly. I called her name, but there was no answer. I searched the cabin, but she was nowhere to be found. Her things were still there, her bag and clothes untouched. Panic started to set in. I ran outside, shouting for her, but the woods seemed to swallow my voice. The path we had walked the day before looked different, almost like it had never been there. I had no idea what to do, so I went back inside, hoping she had just gone for a walk and would be back soon. Hours passed and there was still no sign of her. I tried to tell myself she had just left, that she had decided to go without waking me up, but the car keys were still on the counter, and her phone was dead on the nightstand. As night came, the cabin felt colder. The dread I had felt the night before returned, but it was worse this time. I couldn't shake the feeling that something terrible had happened to her, something I couldn't explain. The silence in the cabin was crushing, pressing in on me from every side. I didn't sleep that night. I sat by the fireplace, staring into the dying flames, waiting for something to happen, for her to come back. But she never did. When morning finally came, I grabbed my things and left the cabin as fast as I could. I drove straight to the nearest town and called the police. They searched the woods for days but found nothing. No sign of her, no clue that she had ever been there at all. I still don't know what happened to her that night. The cabin is still there, hidden deep in the woods, waiting for the next person to stumble upon it. Sometimes I wonder if it was the cabin itself that took her, like it needed something from her, something it couldn't get from just anyone. I've never gone back, and I never will. Whatever happened in those woods is something that will stay with me forever. The memory of that place haunts me, a dark shadow I can't escape, whispering that some things should never be found. Every now and then, in the dead of night, I wake up with the feeling that I'm still being watched, that whatever was in that cabin followed me home, waiting for the right moment to take something from me too. My stepsister and I had been talking about this cabin trip for a while. We both wanted to get away from the busy city and have some quiet time. The cabin we found was small, hidden deep in the woods. It took us hours to drive there, but when we finally arrived, it looked perfect. It was surrounded by tall trees, and there was nothing around for miles. No people, no noise, just peace and quiet. It was exactly what we were looking for. The first night felt normal. We unpacked our stuff, made something to eat, and sat by the small fireplace. There was no phone signal, no TV, nothing but the sound of the wind and the woods outside. At first it felt kind of nice, but the quiet started to feel heavy after a while. I couldn't stop noticing how silent everything was. By the time we went to bed, I was feeling a bit weird about it, but I told myself it was just because I wasn't used to this much quiet. The next day, we decided to walk around the woods near the cabin. The trees were really thick, and there weren't many clear paths. It felt like we were the only people around for miles. After walking for a while, I saw something strange. There was a pile of rocks stacked neatly near a tree. It didn't look like it was there naturally. Someone had to have put them there. Something about it made me stop and stare. My stepsister didn't think much of it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't really alone. That night I couldn't sleep. The wind outside seemed louder, and I kept hearing what sounded like footsteps just outside the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but my mind wouldn't let it go. I stayed awake, listening for every little sound. The footsteps would come and go, like someone was slowly walking around the cabin. They would stop, then start again a few minutes later, like they were circling us. By morning, I was exhausted but relieved that nothing bad had happened. My stepsister was still asleep, so I stepped outside to get some air. That's when I saw it. The same pile of rocks from the day before, but now it was closer to the cabin. I hadn't noticed it there last night. It was just sitting at the edge of the clearing, like a marker. I stared at it for a long time, trying to convince myself it had always been there. But I knew it hadn't. I didn't tell my stepsister about it. Maybe I was just overthinking. We spent the day trying to enjoy ourselves, walking further into the woods, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching us. Every rustle of leaves made me jump. The deeper we went into the woods, the more it felt like someone was following us. But every time I looked around, there was no one there. When we got back to the cabin, there was another pile of rocks right by the front door. This one was bigger, taller, like someone had been working on it while we were gone. My skin crawled, and I could feel the hair on the back of my neck standing up. Someone was playing with us, messing with our heads, but there was no sign of anyone around. No footprints, no sound, nothing. That night was worse. I woke up again to the sound of footsteps, but this time, they were louder and closer. My heart was pounding as I lay in bed, too scared to move. The footsteps stopped right outside the cabin, and then I heard a soft knock on the window. It wasn't loud or fast, just a slow, quiet tap, like whoever was out there wanted me to know they were there, but weren't in any rush. They knew I wasn't going anywhere. I didn't dare look. I just stayed there, my eyes shut tight, waiting for it to go away. It felt like forever, but eventually, everything went quiet again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. In the morning, my stepsister finally noticed the rock piles. She mentioned how strange it was, but she didn't seem scared, just confused. I couldn't take it anymore. I told her we needed to leave. Something wasn't right, and I didn't want to stick around to find out what was going on. She didn't argue much, but I could tell she thought I was overreacting. As we packed up, I kept checking over my shoulder, feeling like someone was watching us the entire time. We loaded up the car and started down the dirt road, and I felt a bit better. I thought maybe we were finally safe, getting away from whatever had been out there. But as we turned onto the main road, I looked back at the cabin one last time. That's when I saw him. There was a man standing in the clearing, right where the rock piles had been. He wasn't moving, just watching us leave. I couldn't see his face clearly, but it didn't matter. The fact that he had been out there the whole time made my stomach drop. He had been there, watching us, and we never knew. The worst part was realizing how close he had been to us, how easily he could have done something if he wanted to. As we drove away, the feeling didn't leave me. The thought of him standing there watching us like we were prey stuck with me long after we were gone. And then it hit me. We were lucky to get out when we did. He wasn't just watching. He was waiting. And whatever he was waiting for, I'm terrified that we almost found out. I decided to take my kids camping for the weekend while my husband was away on a business trip. It was just me and the two of them, hoping to create some memorable moments together. We found a quiet spot at a small campground by a lake. It was only a couple of hours from home, so it seemed like the perfect place. Safe and close enough to get to easily, but still far enough to feel like an adventure. The first day went smoothly. We set up the tent, roasted marshmallows, and the kids had a blast splashing around in the lake. It felt great to be out of our usual routine. As night came, I tucked the kids into their sleeping bags and sat by the fire, enjoying the calm. The stars were bright and the fire crackled softly. Everything was peaceful, and I began to unwind. The campground was small, and from what I could see, there weren't many other people there. A few tents were scattered around, but it felt like we had the place mostly to ourselves. Around midnight, I decided to call it a night. The kids were sound asleep, and the fire had burned down to just glowing embers. I crawled into the tent, zipped it up, and lay down beside them. In the middle of the night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. Everything was quiet except for the soft rustling of leaves in the breeze. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound, like someone walking on gravel. I froze and listened carefully. The sound was slow and deliberate, and it seemed to be getting closer to the tent. My heart started racing. I thought it might be an animal, but the footsteps were too heavy and controlled. I reached out to check on the kids, making sure they were still asleep. I didn't want to wake them up and frighten them. The footsteps stopped right outside the tent. I could hear someone, or something, breathing slowly and heavily, almost as if they were trying to stay unnoticed. My mind raced. I had no way to see who or what was outside without making noise, and there was no easy escape. I felt completely trapped. I stayed perfectly still, hardly daring to breathe. The minutes dragged on, feeling like hours. The person outside started moving again, walking around the tent and dragging their feet. I could see a shadow shifting through the tent fabric as they moved. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the noise stopped. The breathing, the footsteps, everything went silent. I strained my ears, waiting, but heard nothing. I didn't dare move, even though my body was tense and sore. At some point, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, it was morning. The sun was just coming up, and the kids were still fast asleep beside me. I quietly unzipped the tent and looked outside. There was no one around, but the ground was disturbed. It looked like someone had been walking in circles around our tent all night. We packed up quickly, as soon as the kids were awake. I didn't say anything to them. I didn't want to scare them. But as we drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had been watched. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone following us. Even now, I still can't forget that night. The way those footsteps circled us, getting closer and closer. What chills me the most is the thought that whoever was out there might still be watching, waiting for the next chance to get closer. Since then, I haven't taken the kids camping again. I can't shake the feeling that whatever was out there is still lurking, just beyond the edge of the light. I had been looking forward to this camping trip with my son for weeks. We set up our tent by a small, quiet lake, surrounded by thick woods, far from other campsites. It was supposed to be a weekend escape, just the two of us, away from the noise and stress of daily life. The first day was perfect. We spent our time fishing and cooking over the campfire. As night came, the forest was alive with the sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of animals in the bushes. I felt satisfied as I watched my son fall asleep in his sleeping bag. Around midnight, I woke up to a weird noise. It was a soft, steady tapping coming from outside the tent. At first, I tried to ignore it, thinking it might be a branch moving in the wind, but the tapping grew louder and seemed to come from different directions. I quietly unzipped the tent and went outside, trying to find the source of the sound. Under the moonlight, the forest looked eerie. I walked a few steps away from the tent and saw nothing unusual, just the dark shapes of the trees. I thought it was just the wind and went back to bed. But the tapping didn't stop. It kept going all night and seemed to get closer each time. The next morning, I looked around the campsite. There were no signs of animals or other people, just the same quiet forest. We decided to go for a hike, hoping to distract myself from the strange noises. When we got back to the campsite in the evening, everything seemed fine at first. I started cooking dinner while my son played by the water. As I looked up, I saw something odd on the tent. There were small, muddy handprints smeared on the fabric, about the size of a child's hand. A chill ran down my spine. I checked around the tent, but found no footprints or other signs of anyone being there. I tried to think of it as a prank, or maybe a stray animal, but as night fell, the tapping started again. This time it was louder and more urgent, as if someone was trying to get inside. I decided we would leave early the next morning. I stayed awake all night, sitting by the fire and watching the tent. The tapping continued, and I heard occasional scurrying sounds near the tent, but I never saw anything. At dawn, we packed up quickly and drove home. Once we were back, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread. Later, I found out that other campers nearby had reported similar noises and even sightings of strange figures in the woods. No one could explain what was happening, but it made me realize we weren't alone out there. Looking back, I feel a mix of relief and lingering fear. We had narrowly escaped a much worse situation. The trip, which had started as a simple father-son adventure, ended with a chilling reminder that the woods hold more secrets than we understand. The strange tapping and the muddy handprints were never explained, and they left a lasting mark on my memory. Sometimes when I think back, I wonder what was out there in the dark, just beyond the edge of our campsite, waiting and watching.
I'm a female in my late 20s, and this happened fairly recently. Nothing bad happened to me, but I'm lucky it didn't, and it easily could have. There's a conservation area that I used to like to walk in regularly. It's beside a golf course, near an ordinary subdivision just off a busy road, and is popular with dog walkers, photographers, and nature enthusiasts. The conservation area is fairly well maintained and alerts its users that there are hidden cameras everywhere. My point in bringing attention to all of this is to say that, by all accounts, this is a very safe, ordinary, urban wooded area in a populated area. One big thing about me is that I like isolation to recharge. I dislike crowded trails, so by convention I go in off-peak hours or when the weather is unpleasant. Not dangerous, just unpleasant, too cold, lightly raining, foggy, etc. I stay safe, but I like there to be as few people around as possible. In the city, in daylight, I don't feel like I'm taking any risks by doing this. There was one day that I went around 4 p.m. or so on a frigid, rainy Monday in November. On days like that, there are maybe only 1 or 2 dog walkers, but today there was no car in the parking lot except for a dirty blue pickup truck with a man sitting in it. I noticed that he was looking at me, but that didn't really bother me. I was just happy to see the trail was empty. On this particular day, I went to the area to practice my navigation skills. I was learning how to use a compass at the time, and it's good to practice that skill in an area where you won't get lost. So I decided to go off the trail to a big pine plantation, which is a big open area with large mature pine trees. If you're not familiar, it's not a hiking area, or really that interesting in any way, and definitely off-trail. You wouldn't get there unless you really wanted to get there. I picked my first landmark and sighted it using my compass, then started pacing towards it. I found myself about halfway there when I heard rustling through the bushes. I turned around, and I saw the man from the dirty blue pickup standing there, entering the pine plantation. He was in his mid-50s, white, a little pudgy, wearing a baggy beige cardigan and blue slacks. I felt pretty alert at this point. It felt out of place somehow. I took note of it, but pretended to keep walking with my compass, because I didn't want to seem weird. I looked at him. He pretended to ignore me. I was getting a really bad gut feeling about the situation for some reason. At this point, I felt like he was following me, but I have an anxiety disorder, so I try not to freak out for zero reason. I don't want to ruin my relaxation time. It's just a guy walking around, no big deal. To see if he was following me, I pivoted 180 degrees and walked directly towards the trail again. He was still following me. I walked through the bushes onto the trail. He was still following me. By this point, I was freaked out. The pine plantation entrance is only about 50 feet from the trail, so this guy would have walked 50 feet, entered the pine plantation, and then decided that was it for the day. Bad odds, definitely following me. I quickly exited the trail, and when I'm leaving the parking lot, I see that he's still looking at me. I took the long way home. The experience freaked me out, and I only visited the area once more before the second encounter. Second encounter. This time, it was January. I wanted to go bird watching. A week prior, I'd seen an owl in the same pine plantation. I was practicing navigation again and wanted to see it again. I'd seen it about an hour before sundown, so I figured that was a good time to try to see it again in the same area. I checked the parking lot, and there was no blue pickup truck, but there were 2 other cars with men. One was a red sedan with heavily tinted windows, and it looked like the other one was empty. So, I went on the trail again. The area should be totally empty. Good. Unfortunately, not. About 20 feet into the trail, I heard footsteps behind me. I don't like when people walk behind me, but it's not a crime, and I'll lose them soon. When I go to the pine plantation, I'm sure you know where this is going. When I walk into the pine plantation, I hear the same rustling of the bushes as before. I turn around and see the same man from before. I feel a wave of terror and dread overcome me. Alone in a muddy forest with a possible stalker. But it still felt so calm, so mundane. To confirm my fears, I walk over to the area where I saw the owl last week and pause to look for it. Who do I see next to me? The same freaking guy from before. I'm terrified at this point, and every part of me is screaming to run. So I walk as fast as I can toward the trail again. I pass some random guy in the same pine plantation, and I smile at him, just totally on autopilot. He smiles back. It wasn't until I was in the parking lot that I got freaked out. There was a second person in the same pine plantation. Could they have been connected somehow? I stop briefly in the parking lot and take out a small notepad to quickly write down the license plates of the two cars. This gives the original man time to catch up to the parking lot. I am booking it now on foot out of the parking lot, and he yells toward me, "Can I give you a ride?" I just shake my head and keep walking. As I walk away, he begins to follow me in his car. He waits at the intersection to see which direction I'm going, and I decide to walk through a busy park to lose him. He pulls into a nearby hidden driveway and stares at me. He takes out his phone to presumably take a photo of me, noting which direction I'm walking in. Then he does a U-turn and drives fast the other way. Conclusion. I took the long way home, filled out a police report, and the police opened an investigation on it. I have not gone back to the conservation area since. The experience has definitely left me with an ongoing nervousness about being alone. Doubly so because I don't know who the second guy is. I passed him so quickly, I only know that he was in his mid-50s, had glasses, and was bald. The police unfortunately told me that there's nothing they can really do at this point. So, the best I can do is stay vigilant and try not to let it freak me out too much. Unfortunately, this has totally ruined my love for going out into the wilderness alone. Nothing bad happened, but I think that was more because I was able to escape and lose him, or them, before anything did happen. In summer 2019, my partner and I, both in our early 20s, decided to take a road trip to Vancouver, Canada, and then stay at Golden Ears Provincial Park. We enjoyed camping, had spring break, and wanted to do something different to make the most out of our vacation. My partner had never been out of the US, and it seemed like a crazy new experience for both of us. It was a 6-day trip with Airbnbs in each stop, and the grand finale was a reserved campsite at Golden Ears, which was really close to the water, Owlet Lake. We packed terribly. I had a giant tent, brought a bunch of fruits and veggies to eat healthily, stored them in a cooler that was way too small, and brought a cutting board and knife to break up snacks while driving. We started in California, switching off driving our bright red Ford Fiesta. We drove through Oregon and Washington and made it to Vancouver. We spent a day or two in each state, drank a little too much, and stayed out way too late. Canada was the best part, and Owlet Lake felt like walking in a painting. We walked barefoot on the rocks with our toes in the freezing cold lake, hiked around, and saw a beautiful waterfall where we saw a couple taking pictures of each other for an hour. We started modeling the same poses from afar. Everything was perfect. The campsite was empty except for the other couple, and we went to bed early that night. It was quiet. I woke up to crackling sounds outside my tent. My partner was still asleep and snoring. I didn't think much of it because it was pitch black, probably an animal. The crackling continued closer to the tent. I sat up and grabbed my phone. The brightness came on, and I turned it off, almost blinding myself with the light. In those 2 seconds, I could make out a person right outside our tent. I froze and sat up. They weren't moving, and were close enough to unzip the tent. I started poking my partner because I had no idea what to do. I woke them up and said, "There's someone outside the tent." Then I heard footsteps, quiet footsteps, walking out of our campsite. My partner started saying, What are you talking about?" in a sleepy haze. A truck or a car was parked right outside our camping area. No one was near our campsite. It started up and then drove off. They didn't turn their lights on until they turned the corner and were well out of view. I couldn't really make out much, but it definitely looked like a truck. I was shaking, and my partner couldn't piece together what was happening. I wanted to leave, but the Golden Ears gate locks until about 7 or 8 a.m. It was 1 a.m., so we were going to be there for the rest of the night. We moved to the Ford Fiesta and tried to sleep in the tightly packed car. She fell asleep immediately and thought I was paranoid. Maybe it could have been a park ranger, but it seemed way too weird of behavior for a park ranger. So I ended up sitting there wide awake for about 2 hours, cars locked. I wanted to sleep, but I couldn't. I was sitting in the passenger seat and my partner was in the driver's seat, fast asleep. It was now 3 a.m. I was half awake when I saw a car slowly driving up the road, its lights off as it rounded the corner. It had to have been the same truck. I was scared, but adrenaline was pumping. It slowly rounded the corner and pulled up directly in front of our campsite once again, in the same spot. I felt like I was going to throw up. Outside, I had no weapons, except for that same knife we used for the fruit and veggies, so I grabbed the knife and tried to make myself look angry, crazy, and big. I sat straight up in the passenger seat, holding that knife, keeping it at eye level, and stared deadpan at the truck in the pitch black, just like the farmer in Grant Wood's American Gothic painting. The truck stopped and turned off. A light shone directly into my face from inside the truck. I stared back, terrified, clutching my bright red Ford Fiesta and my large kitchen knife, not blinking. The truck started up again, turned on its lights, and they stayed on, blinding me. The truck pulled out, turned around, and went back where it came from. My heart was pounding the entire time. I woke my partner and said, "We need to get the hell out of here." We packed up by throwing things into the car and sat there awake until 6 a.m. We drove home and didn't stop, constantly rehearsing and trying to make sense of the situation. We ultimately decided we just needed some sleep. It was supposed to be a quiet weekend. My neighbor Tom and I decided to camp in the woods behind our houses. We set up our tents a few hundred feet apart, hoping to get away from the everyday grind. As night came, I built a fire and sat by it, enjoying the usual forest sounds. I noticed Tom's tent was unusually quiet. It struck me as odd, but I didn't think much of it. Around midnight, the forest went eerily quiet. The usual chirping of crickets and rustling leaves stopped, replaced by a strange silence. I heard soft rustling noises coming from Tom's tent. It sounded like someone or something was moving around inside. I figured it was just the night and tried to relax. Then I saw a flashlight beam flickering in the distance from Tom's direction. I thought he might be searching for something. I picked up my flashlight and went over to check if he needed help. As I got closer, I called out softly, but no one answered. The flashlight beam was moving in an odd way. When I reached Tom's tent, I saw it was unzipped, and the flashlight was on the ground, still shining. The tent was empty. My heart started pounding. I looked around, feeling more and more uneasy. The forest was unnervingly quiet again. I heard footsteps behind me, quick, deliberate steps. I turned around, but there was no one there. My gut told me to get back to my tent and call for help. I rushed back, trying to stay calm. I grabbed my phone, but realized there was no signal. I kept my flashlight on and looked around nervously. Hours passed, and the silence fell heavily. Just before dawn, I heard a voice. It wasn't Tom's. It was someone calling for help from the woods. The voice was weak and desperate. I followed the sound, pushing through the thick brush. Eventually, I found Tom. He was disoriented and hurt badly. He had been attacked and knocked out cold. Tom later said he heard someone approaching his tent, so he grabbed the flashlight to check it out. When he stepped outside, someone hit him from behind. He never saw who it was, but his injuries showed the attacker had left him for dead. The police came and searched the area. They didn't find the attacker, but they said it was likely someone local with a bad record. We were lucky to have survived. The worst part was when Tom mentioned seeing dark figures moving around his tent before he was attacked. It felt like the woods themselves had turned against us. We never found out who did this or why. The woods were no longer a safe place, but a chilling reminder that danger could be lurking in the darkest corners. I still get shivers thinking about it and avoid those woods whenever I can. I went camping with my grandmother deep in the woods. She loved being outside and somehow talked me into coming along for the weekend. I wasn't really excited about it, but she always looked so calm out there, so I agreed. We set up our tent near a small stream with tall trees all around us. The first day was pretty quiet. We walked a bit, cooked dinner over a small fire, and watched the stars before heading into the tent to sleep. That night, something felt weird. I couldn't explain it, but the woods were too quiet. No wind, no bugs, just still. I lay there for a while, staring at the roof of the tent, feeling uneasy. I told myself it was just because we were so far from anything, and I tried to sleep. The next day, we spent most of it walking around, but that strange feeling stayed with me. Every time I looked at the trees, I got this sense that something was watching us. My grandmother didn't seem to notice anything strange, so I didn't mention it. By the time the sun started going down, I was more than ready to go to sleep and just get through the night. While we sat by the fire that evening, I kept hearing odd noises from the woods. It wasn't animals, at least not any I could recognize. The sounds were low, like something big was moving through the bushes, but it never got close enough to see. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, but I didn't want to worry my grandmother, so I stayed quiet. After we put out the fire, we went back to the tent. It was even quieter than the night before. I lay there for what felt like forever, that uneasy feeling growing stronger. My grandmother was sound asleep next to me, totally unaware of how tense I was. At some point, I must have fallen asleep, because the next thing I knew, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. They weren't far from the tent, maybe 20 feet or so, and they were slow and steady. I froze, not moving a muscle, listening closely. The steps circled the tent, not too close, but never too far. This wasn't just some animal wandering by. Whoever or whatever it was, they were taking their time. I stayed completely still, hardly breathing. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and I hoped they had left, but then they started again, this time even closer. My heart was pounding so hard, I thought whoever was out there could probably hear it. I had no idea what to do. Eventually, the footsteps faded into the woods, but I knew it wasn't over. I couldn't sleep after that. I lay awake, listening to every little sound outside the tent. The night dragged on forever, but when the sun finally came up, I was relieved. Tired, but relieved. That morning, we packed up to leave. I didn't tell my grandmother about the noises, but I couldn't wait to get out of there. As we hiked back to the car, I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling like something, or someone, was watching us. The woods were too quiet again, and it made me feel like we weren't alone. Just before we got to the car, I noticed something by the tree line. There were footprints. They weren't animal tracks, they were big human footprints, fresh, and they had been right next to our tent. I stared at the prints, my stomach turning. Someone had been out there, walking around us while we slept, watching us. I looked back at the woods, but I couldn't see anyone. Still, I knew, somehow, they were still out there, watching, waiting. Maybe they had followed us the whole time, hiding just out of sight. I realized then that no matter how far we drove, no matter how far we tried to get away, we had been seen, marked, and maybe one day they'd come back. I needed a break. Being a cop can take a toll on you, so I figured camping alone for a weekend would help me clear my mind. I found a quiet spot deep in the woods, far away from the noise of cars and the constant rush of people. It felt like the perfect escape. The first night was calm. All I could hear were the sounds of the forest, leaves blowing in the wind, birds singing, and every now and then a branch snapping in the distance. It was peaceful. The quiet and fresh air were just what I needed. But on the second night, things felt different, wrong even. I set up my tent and got a fire going, but something was off. The forest wasn't as lively as it had been. There were no animal sounds, no breeze, just this strange, heavy silence. I tried to ignore it, thinking maybe I was just overthinking things because of the job. It's hard to fully relax after years of being a cop. You're always alert, always watching. But this silence, it was too much. Felt unnatural. At some point, I started hearing footsteps. They were slow, like whoever or whatever it was trying not to be noticed. They were far away, but not too far. I couldn't tell if it was real or if I was just getting jumpy, but it was enough to make me uneasy. I grabbed my flashlight and scanned the area around my campsite, shining the light into the trees. Nothing. No movement, no sign of anyone. I went back to sitting by the fire, staring into the dark woods. I kept waiting for the sound to come back, but all I could hear was the crackling of the fire. It stayed quiet, and I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer, something harmless. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Hours passed, and I decided to get some sleep. I crawled into my tent, trying to calm myself down, but then I heard the footsteps again. This time, they were much closer. My heart started racing. I grabbed my flashlight and quietly unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. I felt this tightness in my chest as I pointed the light toward the trees again. Nothing. Just darkness. But then, as I turned to go back to my tent, I saw them. Footprints. Fresh ones circling my campsite. My blood ran cold. These weren't mine. Someone had been here, walking around me while I sat by the fire, watching me. That realization hit me hard. Someone had been out there, maybe still was, watching the whole time. My heart was pounding. I backed into my tent, grabbed my bag and flashlight, and started packing as fast as I could. I wanted out of there. But then I heard it again. Those footsteps. And now they weren't just coming from one direction. I could hear them all around me. I froze for a second, listening, trying to figure out how close they were. Whoever was out there, they were close, and there wasn't just one of them. I could feel the eyes on me from the dark, just outside the reach of the firelight. My instincts kicked in. I grabbed my stuff and started heading down the trail. My flashlight shook in my hand. I could hear them following me. Not too close, but close enough to make sure I knew they were there. I walked faster, then started running. The footsteps kept up with me, staying just out of sight. I didn't look back. I didn't stop until I reached my car. I threw my gear in, jumped in the driver's seat, and sped down the dirt road. Before I pulled away, I looked back one last time. Standing at the edge of the trees, just where the light from my car reached, were a few dark shapes. People watching me. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. I sat in the car for a while, catching my breath. I thought about reporting it, but I knew better. No one would find anything. I've seen enough in my years on the force to know that sometimes the worst things aren't supernatural or from some fairy tale. Sometimes it's just people. And what's scary is those people out there, they knew the woods better than me. They weren't just watching me for fun, they were waiting. They wanted me to know I wasn't alone out there. And what's worse is, I got away. But I have no idea how many others didn't. I've posted this on another thread back in August, but I figured I'd share it again. Of the countless hours I've spent in the woods, it's the one time, for only a few seconds, that I can't explain. I distance hike when I can, and sometimes this means getting up early or staying out late to get as many miles in as possible. Sometimes that means walking in pitch dark with a low-light headlamp, and it gets spooky. I grew up in the woods of this area. I've slept under a canopy of stars more nights than I can even count. I've trekked thousands of miles of trails, riverbanks, lake shores, ridges, bottoms, bogs, and creeks. I've hunted game. I'm establishing this because it's important you understand. I've heard, seen, and smelled everything this region has to offer in the way of wilderness. My scariest experience, though, happened around 4:30 in the morning. It was late spring, so the first morning light wouldn't be visible in the treetops for maybe another 30 to 45 minutes. Another hour passed until sunrise, and I was on mile 5. I was in a low bottom that was wedged between two steep ridges. The trail I was on was narrow, muddy, and completely hemmed in by thick underbrush with young maple and old oak growth. I was focused on the small light from my headlamp, just one step after the other, completely zoned out. Then I heard a loud crack, and I froze solid. This is the part I have trouble describing. At 4:30 in the springtime, it means I'm the only thing making noise. No birds chirping, nothing. Dead quiet. Mid-step, I froze when fight or flight kicked in. You have these immediate instinct thoughts. The thought that instantly flashed in my mind as I stood there, balancing myself in silence, was, if I hear that again, I'm turning around and going back the way I came, fast. Why? Because that sound was not a branch breaking. It wasn't deadfall. It wasn't a widowmaker. I was damn sure I just heard something intentional. Hearing it twice? That meant get the hell out of here. To describe it as best as I can, it sounded like a decent-sized wooden stick being violently whacked against a smallish tree, more a fungal bat-sized stick than a baseball bat. The distinction in my head being that this sound was a crack, not a thud or a thump. I've described it as explosive in the past because it was so sudden and terribly loud. I had the sense it was about 50 yards directly in front of me. It was loud and it was clear. Now, as I stood there, completely spooked, I realized the soon-to-be worst part of my situation. I knew where the sound came from, and I knew where the trail went. In about 30 yards, I was going to come to a 180-degree turn and start up the ridge, away from the creek. This meant that as soon as I got the courage to move toward the noise, I was going to have my back turned to it and get up that ridge. And that made me very nervous. My head somewhere between a methane murderer and Bigfoot bludgeoning. Minutes passed. I just breathed my foggy breath into my glasses and listened. Still nothing. Still dead quiet. I've got maybe 20 or 30 minutes until first light. I cranked up the headlamp and started to slowly creep toward the 180 turn. When you wear a headlamp in the woods at night, every tree branch in front of you casts a big black moving shadow on the trail, and this definitely didn't help. I get to the turn and quickly make the bend. I'm moving pretty fast at this point, trying to be quiet, taking tiny, shallow breaths so I can listen while humping it up the trail. Then I smell it. A stench hits me that I can't describe. I just imagined wet, rotten death. I've actually worked scenes where humans have expired in a past life as a firefighter, and this was like days-old decomposition, but it just smelled strange. I kept walking fast, and by the time I made it to the top of that ridge, I was huffing and the first light was showing. But I didn't stop until full light was out and the birds were chirping. I've heard it all in our woods. I've smelled it all. I'm telling you, I don't know what the hell that was. Deadfall, especially with leaved-out branches, makes a lot of noise on the way down. I've heard it many times. I just don't know. I was camping alone, deep in the woods, far from anyone. I had been doing this for years, and I always liked the quiet at night. The only sounds were the crackling of the fire and the soft rustling of leaves in the wind. It usually made me feel calm, but this time something felt different. I couldn't tell why, but it just felt wrong. It started just before sunset. I was setting up my tent when I noticed how quiet the woods were. Too quiet. No crickets, no birds, nothing. At first, I shrugged it off, but as the night went on, the silence started to bother me. I built a fire and sat by it, eating my dinner. That's when I began to feel it, a strange feeling, like someone was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see someone standing there, but no one was there. It was just darkness outside the reach of the fire's light. Still, I couldn't shake that feeling. The longer I sat there, the worse it got. I told myself it was all in my head. I was out here alone, far from anyone. There was no reason to feel uneasy, but I couldn't stop the growing fear that was creeping in. Eventually, I decided to go to bed. I figured I'd feel better after some sleep. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and lay down, trying to relax. But every little noise outside sounded louder now. Every twig snapping or leaf crunching made my heart race. I kept telling myself it was just animals, but it didn't feel like animals. The sounds were too slow, too careful. I don't know how long I lay there staring at the roof of my tent, listening to the night. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Slow, heavy footsteps, just outside my tent. They stopped right next to me. I froze, holding my breath, too scared to move. There was nothing but silence. The footsteps stopped, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. I waited, barely breathing, for something to happen, but nothing did. After what felt like hours, the footsteps started again, moving away slowly, fading into the trees. I stayed still for a long time, listening, but the footsteps didn't come back. I finally worked up the nerve to grab my flashlight and unzip the tent. I shined the light into the trees, looking for any sign of what or who had been out there, but there was nothing. No tracks, no broken branches, no proof that anyone had been there at all. But I knew what I heard. My heart was still racing, and I knew I had to get out of there. I packed up everything as fast as I could, barely taking time to think. I threw my stuff in the car and sped off, not looking back. I never figured out what or who it was that night, but sometimes when I'm alone in a quiet place, I still hear those footsteps in my mind, slow and heavy. It makes me wonder if whatever it was didn't really leave that night. Maybe it's still out there, waiting in the dark for me to come back. About 5 years ago, my sister, a friend of mine, my girlfriend, and I decided to take a trip to Sierra County, California, deep in the mountains near a small town called Downeyville. We were heading to a brewfest in town and chose to camp rather than book a hotel. We took a road called Kala, also known as Forest Road 25, which eventually becomes Forest Road 55. Looking for an off-grid camping spot, we drove about 7 miles up this road from the main road leading to Downeyville, which was at least 5 or 6 miles before reaching the town. There wasn't much out there except for a few campsites right off the main road. We hadn't gone much farther when we found a clearing among the trees and decided to set up camp. As we were finishing setting up around sunset, an older woman suddenly appeared, walking into our camp from the woods. She was dressed in what looked like hippie-style clothing, probably around 60 years old, frail and small, with brownish-gray hair. My first thought was how strange it was because there were no cars or other signs of people anywhere on this road. I asked her what she was doing up there, and she said she was camping just on the other side of the creek with her husband. Then she asked if we had any water, which seemed odd given how far we were from civilization. We gave her some water, and she then asked for a cigarette. I asked if she had come from Downeyville, but she said no. She was from Culvert, pointing further up the mountain, saying they had been walking for a long time. I offered her the rest of my cigarettes, telling her I would buy more in Downeyville. She seemed oddly moved by this gesture. She pulled a silver cross necklace from her collar and insisted I take it. Not being religious, I refused, but she kept insisting, more seriously each time. My girlfriend, sister, and friend were watching this, clearly creeped out. There was something strange about her, like she wasn't from modern times. Even when I handed her the water bottle, it seemed foreign to her. Eventually, we told her we had to leave and she wandered back into the woods. On our way out, we looked for any sign of another camp or car in the direction she pointed to, but found nothing. We returned to camp around 11:30 or midnight, had a campfire, and then went to bed around 1 a.m. At around 3 a.m., my sister, who was in a tent down the hill near the creek, said she heard something walking around on the other side of the creek. We talked back and forth for about 20 minutes. I couldn't hear much, but she was getting more and more scared, so I told her to come sleep in my tent with my girlfriend, and I would sleep in hers. I had a .45 pistol and didn't think much of it. We traded spots, and I went back to sleep in her tent. About 20 minutes later, I heard something walking around near us, very distinctly pacing back and forth in the woods. I couldn't tell if it was a person or an animal, but it definitely wasn't a small animal. This went on for about an hour, with me falling asleep and then being woken up again. I was getting unnerved and a bit annoyed since I was trying to sleep off some beer. It kept going until I heard whatever it was start crossing the creek and coming up the embankment toward my tent. It walked right past my tent and toward our fire and my truck, which was backed up to the fire. I heard something rustling around our camp, and then I heard something banging on metal. I realized whatever it was trying to break into my Bronco. My first thought was that it was a bear smelling food in the truck. Now I was really freaked out. With no other option, I slowly and quietly unzipped my tent, carefully poked my head out with my gun, and looked toward my truck and the fire. To my surprise, It was a full-grown buck, horns and all, standing there, staring at the embers of our fire like it was trying to warm up. I was relieved, but decided to scare it off. I hit the wall of the tent, half out of the doorway, and yelled, "Get out of here!" To my shock, the deer just turned its head, looked at me, and then back at the fire. It didn't move. I tried again, louder and more animated this time. It slowly turned and started walking toward me, which was extremely unnerving. Deer are usually scared of people and don't approach them. At this point, I was really freaked out. It was a big buck. I quickly got back in the tent, zipped it up, and just waited. The buck walked up to the tent, and I could see its silhouette from the firelight on the tent wall. It stood there next to the entrance to my tent for a good minute or two, then continued snooping around our campsite. Eventually, it wandered off in the same direction the woman had gone. Throughout the night, I kept hearing something different, a deer moving around near the creek on the other side. I hardly got any sleep, but around 5 a.m., I must have dozed off because I was suddenly woken up by the sound of the woman on the other side of the creek, calling out, "Hello? Hello? Can you hear me? Can I have some water? I'm really thirsty." I ignored her because I was so damn tired and because it was so creepy. She stopped, then came back about 15 minutes later, calling out again. She did this a few times, and it just weirded me out. It was just starting to get light in the sky, the really early morning. We all got up, packed up, and began the 2.5-hour drive home. On the way out, I pulled off on a dirt path to see if I could spot her camp down an embankment. I found an old fire ring, cold as the earth, clearly not used in a while. But there were signs someone had been there recently, like Camel cigarette butts, the same brand I smoke. Then I saw something that made my blood run cold. A whole head of brownish-gray hair, like a wig that had fallen apart, just lying in the dirt where it looked like someone had been lying. It looked exactly like the woman's hair. I got back in my truck and got out of there fast. The next morning, after getting home, I went out to my truck and noticed my license plate was gone, like it had been torn off. If it had been missing at the campsite, we would have noticed. I can't help but think that whatever that deer, or whatever it was that had been messing with my tailgate, took it. Just weird, creepy stuff, man. I was always close to my sister-in-law, Sarah. We got along great, and our families spent a lot of weekends together. So when she suggested a weekend camping trip, I thought it was a good idea. We figured it would be a good way to get away from work stress and the noise of the city. I had been camping before, but this time felt different. I couldn't shake a weird feeling that something was wrong. We picked a spot deep in the woods, far from any town. The drive up was nice, with the trees growing thicker as we went deeper into the forest. The campsite was beautiful, right by a small clear lake. We set up our tents, gathered some firewood, and settled in for what we thought would be a relaxing night. The first night was calm. We cooked over the fire, told stories, and laughed until we were too tired to stay awake. But the next day, I started noticing things that didn't seem right. First, it was small stuff. The sounds of the forest seemed too quiet, like the usual rustling of leaves and animal noises had stopped. Then, as we sat by the lake, I noticed footprints along the shore that weren't ours. They were fresh, leading out of the water and disappearing into the trees. I didn't say anything to Sarah because I didn't want to freak her out, but I couldn't stop thinking about those footprints. They were big, too big to be a normal person. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but that uneasy feeling wouldn't go away. Later that night, as we sat by the fire again, I heard something in the distance, a low, deep sound like a growl. It was faint, but it made me freeze. Sarah didn't seem to hear it, or if she did, she didn't react. I tried to tell myself it was just an animal, maybe a bear far off in the woods. But the feeling that something was wrong only got stronger. When we finally went to bed, I couldn't sleep. Every little sound outside made me jump. The wind through the trees, the crack of a branch, the rustling of leaves. It all seemed louder, closer. I lay in my tent, staring up at the darkness, listening, waiting for something, anything. Then I heard it again, the growl, closer this time, followed by the sound of heavy footsteps. I sat up, my heart racing. The footsteps were coming from just outside the tent. They were slow, careful, like whatever was out there didn't want to be heard. I held my breath, trying to listen. The footsteps circled the tent, then stopped right at the entrance. I could hear heavy breathing, deep and rough, like something big was just inches away. I wanted to scream to wake Sarah, but I was too scared to move. The breathing went on for what felt like forever. Then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The footsteps slowly moved away, fading into the night. I didn't dare move until the first light of morning. When the sun finally came up, I rushed out of the tent. The ground outside was messed up with large prints pressed deep into the dirt, leading from the tent back into the woods. I woke Sarah, and we packed up as fast as we could, neither of us saying a word to each other. We left the campsite as quickly as possible, neither of us looking back. On the drive home, the silence between us was heavy. We both knew something had been out there, something watching us. We never spoke about what happened that night, but we never went camping again. The fear of whatever was in those woods, of what we might have run into, was enough to keep us far away from the wilderness. To this day, I still think about those footsteps, that breathing, and wonder what was out there. What if we hadn't left when we did? What if it had decided to come into the tent? I'll never know, but I don't need to. The thought of what could have happened is enough to keep me from ever going back. But the thing that still haunts me, the thing I can't forget, is that those footprints didn't just come from the woods. They led back into the lake. Whatever was out there came from the water. Now, every time I see a quiet lake, I wonder what might be lurking just beneath the surface, waiting for its next chance to come ashore. I've always liked the peace of camping. Being out in the wild by myself makes me feel free. This time, I planned to camp for a few days alone, so I found a quiet spot near a small lake deep in the woods. The only sign of other people was a tent set up a few hundred yards away, a man I had met earlier who called himself my neighbor in the wild. He seemed friendly, a bit older, wearing faded camouflage clothes. He mentioned that he used to be in the military, a retired commander. The first day went by without any trouble. I spent the morning setting up my camp, gathering firewood, and getting ready for a quiet evening under the stars. As the sun started to set, I noticed my neighbor standing by the water, staring out at nothing. There was something odd about the way he stood, stiff, almost like he was waiting for something. The next morning, I woke up to find him gone. His tent was still there, but he was nowhere to be seen. At first, I didn't worry. People often head out early to hike or fish, but as the day went on and he didn't come back, I started to feel uneasy. The air felt heavy, and the forest was unusually quiet. I tried to focus on my own tasks, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. By the time night came, he still hadn't returned. I thought about packing up and leaving, but it didn't feel right to just leave without knowing what had happened. So, I decided to walk over to his campsite and check things out. His tent was shut, everything neatly packed away like he hadn't planned to be gone for long. I walked around his campsite, calling out, but there was only silence. That's when I noticed something strange, a small patch of disturbed dirt not far from his tent. It looked like someone had been digging there recently, but the dirt had been hastily covered up. My heart started to race, and I felt panic rising. But I tried to stay calm. I found a stick and started to dig. As I cleared away the dirt, I uncovered a shallow pit. Inside were a few items: a knife, a worn dog tag, and a notebook. The dog tag had a name on it I didn't recognize, but it was the notebook that caught my attention. I flipped through it and saw page after page filled with notes about survival skills, old military missions, and strangely, entries about this very camping trip. The last entry made my blood run cold. It described how he'd been following a man who matched my description. It talked about how he was planning to eliminate the target because the mission wasn't finished. There was no name, but the description was too close to mine. His paranoia, his obsession with this mission, had made him believe I was some kind of enemy. I froze. The forest suddenly felt too quiet, too close. That's when I heard a twig snap behind me. I spun around, but no one was there. I was alone in the clearing, but I could feel eyes on me. My mind raced. He was out there somewhere, watching me, waiting for the right moment. He might have been ex-military, but something had clearly snapped in his mind, and he decided I was the enemy. I didn't stick around to find out what he planned to do. I dropped the notebook and ran back to my camp. I packed up my gear as fast as I could, my hands shaking. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting him to show up at any moment. But he never did. The only sounds were my racing heartbeat and the rustling leaves in the wind. I left the forest that night, driving nonstop until I was miles away. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that he's still out there, his twisted sense of duty pushing him to complete a mission that never existed. As I lie awake at night, I can still picture him standing by the lake, waiting. I can't help but wonder if he's found a new target, or if one day he'll track me down again. I know I should forget about it, but there's something in the way he looked at me, something that tells me this isn't over. Maybe it's just paranoia, or maybe it's the truth, that he's still out there searching, and that I'll never truly be safe.